people who have just joined us, our audience and guest speakers, and welcome to our Art in Conversation seminar. And this time we are talking about synesthesia and its links with language and literature. We know that this topic stands front and center in synesthesia research, and that language seems to somehow play a crucial role in determining or at least shaping the most prevalent types of synesthesia. So this is why it's so exciting to discuss this with our very special guests today, who have this strand and know this strand like a book. So our first speaker is Jane Yardley. Jane is a distinguished novelist coming from the UK, and she is an author of several novels whose intriguing narrative lines pivot around synesthetic experience. And her novel, Painting Ruby Tuesday, tells a story about characters who establish a very special, strong emotional bond through sharing synesthesia. So as one of them describes this, we see things in color that aren't, not just music, numbers, letters, days of the week, people's names. We discussed this with James several months ago, and we're going to watch some bright excerpts of this talk now. Jane, a couple of words to our audience to greet them.
Hello, yes, I'm Jane Yardley. I'm based in Greater London, and I wrote Painting Ruby Tuesday a number of years ago now, but I remember it clearly, and it's still close to my heart, because the synesthetic experiences described in that novel are my own, and the reactions to music, which I love, are my own. Thank you.
Right, so we've downloaded the interview, and those who experience some problems here can follow the link, but we are going to watch the interview right here in Teams.
Yes, so the link is in the chat, and I'm going to share my screen now. If you can't hear, for some reason, let me know, but I think it should work.
Well, I'm an associative synesthete, so the colours flood my mind, but I don't see them in front of me. I associate numbers and letters and words with colour and music, and I adore music, and so the most pleasurable of them all is to hear music in colour. It's indescribably wonderful. I was born with it. I think the real question is when I realised that other people didn't have it. And I must have been really very young, because I can remember being in church in Sunday school. So I would have been about 5 years old, and a particular hymn was Yellow and Runny. And I opened my mouth to say this to a friend, and then I can remember thinking, no, that's only me. Other people don't hear it. So I don't know whether I've made a complete fool of myself. I probably had, going on about my synesthesia, my colour perceptions to others. But from certainly at the age of 5, I realised that this wasn't something that was common. My friends didn't share it. No, I mean, I was a child in the 1960s and a teenager in the 1970s. And at that time, it's my understanding now that psychology tended to focus on phenomena that could be generalized rather than oddities. I made a bit of a fuss of it in my teens as a sort of showing off, because I was a teenage girl. But the synesthesia itself, no, I think that was the only, those were the only occasions when I mentioned it. Other people didn't have it. And just to say, I was well aware that I had an extraordinary memory, and I would do party tricks, but it wasn't until my 30s that I had any idea that they were related, that was related to my synesthesia. I was in my 30s. I was driving a car around the North Circular Road, which is the orbital road around London. I was listening to the BBC's Radio 4, and there was a documentary, and they had this word, synaesthesia. I couldn't even imagine how it was spelled. I mean, where does the sin come into it? But they were describing me. That was very strange. And they were talking about me and people like me, and we were suddenly these people. Now I'm white and I'm straight. I've never been these people. And it's quite uncomfortable to hear myself described as these people. And there were questions about, the first thing we have to do is make sure these people aren't just making it up. And that was where I discovered that a lot of us have extraordinary memories. And much more important to me, I also discovered that a lot of us have marked cognitive deficits, which is a posh way of saying we have laughable failings, that a lot of us, we don't know left from right, we can't find our way around, we spend much of our lives lost, we don't have any real understanding of spatial things, we can't work mechanical things unless we're shown, and of course we get laughed at for it. And it was only a few days later, I was driving a colleague somewhere in London, totally lost. This was in the days before sat-nav. I didn't have a clue where I was. And I can remember I heard myself say to him, I have no sense of direction. It's because I have something called synaesthesia, and it's associated with these following gifts. And suddenly, it was something that I didn't have to be ashamed of. Yeah, my father, I was in my teens. And I don't know why, but I just couldn't have mentioned it, or I mentioned it and nobody noticed. And my father said to my mother, Jane has the same colour oddities that I have. And I didn't know, and I will have been about 14, 15. All the time, every word I read colour, every scrap of music. I used to say that certain music didn't have any colour before I realised it was either black or white, and that's a colour. So everything around me, it's just part of who I am, so I don't stop and think about it. My first novel, the principal character had synaesthesia, as did one of her neighbours. And the principal character, Annie, was a little girl, and her neighbour, whom she loved, was murdered. And what they had shared was their synesthetic experience. So I felt driven, inspired, I think driven really, to include that in my first novel. I had another synesthetic character, another synesthete in my fourth novel. That there was more of a reason, a different sort of rationale for that. That novel included Sibelius's Eighth Symphony, which he never finished, or at least he probably finished it and set fire to. And Sibelius himself had synesthesia, so that was a link between the principal character and Sibelius himself. Other than that, I suppose it probably influences my writing style. Somebody said I have a lot of colour, literally colour, I don't mean figuratively, but I tend to talk about colours in a lot of my writing, which I suppose isn't surprising since that's the world I live in. I suddenly realised I wanted the words Ruby Tuesday in the title. And Ruby Tuesday hadn't actually been written in 1965, which is when the novel is set, but I already wanted an oddity that she would hear music that hadn't yet been written. Now, to me, Tuesday is ruby red. And the moment I realized that, I thought, it's about synesthesia. Ruby Tuesday, They both have synesthesia, Annie does, and the neighbour does. And it was as clear as day, and the whole of the rest of the plot fell into place. One of my friends was horrified that I was writing a book with synesthesia in it. He said, "Jane, this is odd. It's really odd. People aren't going to relate to that." But a lot of other people said, "Oh, well, I've always known that some numbers were masculine and some were feminine." I said, "Well, no, that's synesthesia." And other people saying, "Well, yeah, days of the week are in colour." And so to a lot of readers, I think they suddenly thought, "I've got that. I'd never put a name to it. Didn't know it was special." Oh, that is a difficult one. I think it would have more colour in it. Do you remember, sure you do, remember the book called Perfume, about a murderer? And there it is full of scents, it is full of smell all the way through. I think for a colour synesthete, to use colour all the way through and bind the plot somehow to those colours, that might be beyond my expertise, but that would be a wonderful thing to do. Well, they weren't, they should have been. At school, all the subjects I was good at involved this extraordinary memory that I had, and my creative gifts. So, and of course in science, having that sort of memory isn't really a lot of help. I mean, if I'd had acting ability and been an actress, I could have learned a part in no time at all. In the end, I'm glad I did, and science was a wonderful training for my mind, which could otherwise have been a little unruly, my imagination. But no, I went off along a path for which I was not really prepared, and it was good luck that in the end I did well in it. It was good luck rather than judgment. It took me a long time to realize this. But I can remember hearing some musicologists say that Wagner changed the colors and textures of music. Now, I'm not a Wagnerian, and Wagner doesn't have very much an effect on me, but I suddenly realized that the music that came after him has different colors and has texture, and nothing before Wagner, no music before Wagner has any texture. So I adore 20th century music. I love rock music. I love jazz. I love rap. And there are very few composers before Wagner that I love. Hip hop to me is white and black, and those aren't colors to me. So I think that sort of spoils hip hop. No. In fact, I started my book about Sibelius having loved him since childhood. I fell in love with him. Absolutely adore Sibelius's music. I didn't even realize he was a synesthete until I went to a synesthete conference in New York. And Sean Day, the organizer of it, and he and I were talking. He said, "Well, of course, Sibelius was a synesthete." And I sort of went, yes, because that brought everything together in this plot that I was just beginning to work out in my mind. I would imagine perhaps he meant that the walls must be thin, since one sense is leaking through into another sense. For example, the sense of colour into the sound of music. And of course, he was such a wonderful writer. That is the sort of excellent imagery, I suppose, that one might expect from Nabokov. I'm a very, very great admirer of Nabokov. I am extremely sensitive to language, and it's a nuisance. I will be watching a drama on television or in a film set in the past, and there will be anachronisms in the language that they're using, and I will pick up on those instantly. And I mean, it's so sensitive that I will actually think, that wasn't around in the 1930s. I first heard that on Sunday in November 1989 in Evanston, Illinois. It's literally, it's as bad as that. I think W.H. Auden had a poem in which he says he could hear his lover's voice in the thunder. Yes, I do that. In that poem, that voice is a deep black. And yes, I interpret sounds around me as being speech. Yes, I use a white noise machine to sleep if there's any noise going on, and I can sometimes hear words in it. Very, very slow writer. And I'm probably not the only writer who's terrified by the sight of a blank screen. I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I think a lot of us do. But when something has to be added and I have a blank screen, that's a terrible sight. And I'm very, very slow in filling that page. I don't know whether it was a talent, but at the age of, must have been about 4.5, we start school early over here. And I wrote a story about a little boy called Tom, and he was going around and meeting ghosts and skeletons and all the things that I was interested in. Now, I don't suppose that story had any merit. The point is, I still remember it. I'm in my 60s. I still remember that story. And I think that probably defines a writer, not the quality of it, but the fact that it's of such importance as part of your identity. I learned to read and write as soon as I went to school. I don't remember learning to read or write. I can have a memory of being in the classroom with words written on a blackboard that I could already read. It's difficult for me to answer because I haven't experienced life as a non-synesthete. But I think perhaps metaphors might come more readily to us because our world is a metaphorical world and a different layer from the non-synesthetic world. So that's an additional control.
I'm sorry, can I just ask everyone to mute their microphones because we have a bad sound quality because of it. Thank you.
Confusion for me because Juliet is a rose because they're both the same color. So I think we have another layer for metaphors if we have synesthesia.
Thank you very much. That was it. Thank you very much. That was an incredibly interesting and rich interview. Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you, Anton, for conducting the interview and editing it. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions and comments. Please remember those. When we'll begin the Q&A session, you'll have a chance to ask or comment. And I'm going to introduce our second speaker now. It is Bora Winter, Associate Professor in Cognitive Linguistics at the Department of English Language and Linguistics, University of Birmingham. Professor Winter's research interests include gesture, iconicity, metaphor, and numerical cognition. He authored many articles and books, including the book Sensory Linguistics, Language, Perception, and Metaphor. He's a recipient of the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship. Professor Winter is also editor-in-chief of the journal Language and Cognition and a member of the University of Birmingham's Institute for Interdisciplinary Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Professor Winter, we are very happy you accepted our invitation, and we are very excited for your talk. So please begin. Feel free to share your screen whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you, Jane, for that fantastic interview. I'm super excited about the discussions that will come to this, and thank you for inviting me in the first place, Marina and Anton. Okay, I'm going to do a quick screen share because I have some slides prepared. So let's see. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yeah? Perfect. Okay, then I will start. Okay, so my research is more interested in how language and perception work in general together for all of us. And if you think about it, language must make connection to perception. One of the primary functions of language is to communicate the things that we feel, the things that we hear, the things that we see. And what interests me or what fascinates me is that perception is so vastly multimodal. It's multisensory. When I'm eating something, I have an explosion of temperature and touch and taste sensations all happening at the same time. But language is a different type of medium than perception. And if we then translate those perceptions to language, certain things can happen and certain things can get lost. To ground what I will say in the next 12 minutes or so, in a nice quote that captures this intuition, Feinsilber and Ortony say that language partitions the continuity of experience into discrete units comprised of words and phrases, having a relatively narrow referential range. And here's a sort of image of this. So our vast multisensory perception is sort of compressed by language. And if we then think about words like spicy, they are, if I use that word to describe my taste experience, I'm singling out one particular sensory modality at the expense of other sensory modalities that I've experienced at the same time. And I'm also singling out a particular sub-aspect of that that might not actually capture the true feeling of spiciness, how it presented it to myself. Same goes for other words. Red is at the expense of any other sort of sensory characteristics. Now, when it comes to language and perception, what really fascinates me is that there's quite a rich toolkit that speakers and actually also signers of signed languages draw from when they communicate sensory ideas. There are different ways of carving up or typologizing this toolkit, but in my book, I came up with this typology of different strategies that can be used to communicate sensory content. So we have some sort of semiotic diversity, different means of communicating sensory ideas, and we use different ones in different contexts. So by symbols here, I mean sort of conventionalized, relatively abstract descriptors, and they're conventional in the sense that also their form is relatively arbitrary. So bright, for example, is a completely different word in my native language, German. It's hell. So the form of these words does not resemble the meaning, and you have to know what bright means in your language in order to know what is the sensory perception encoded. That's different from a lot of different ways of communicating sensory content through iconicity. So in spoken language, we have things like onomatopoeia, beep, splash, squeaky. So here the form actually resembles the content. And there's a sort of direct depictive quality in the word itself. And I should say that this is not just onomatopoeia. So iconicity, people think of it as often sort of in spoken languages, we are only depicting auditory impressions. But actually, we've shown that, for example, touch vocabularies harbor iconicity. So we've shown that across languages on the planet, here you see a map of European languages, words for rough surfaces tend to have R's in them as opposed to words for smooth surfaces. And that's a fairly strong pattern. So here you see words, redness here indicates more proportions of R in the touch vocabulary. In English, this works really well. You have rough, rugged, rocky, prickly, abrasive, all of them have R's in them. There's a sort of cross-modal correspondence between touch and sound that has made itself into the lexicon of lots of different languages. So then, if you don't have existing, for example, adjectives to talk about something, we don't have many smell adjectives in English, we can always make up for the fact that we don't have words for sensory perception by talking about the source of that perception. So for example, if I don't have a banana adjective, like a word that specifically describes that smell, I can say it smells like banana. And these sort of source-based constructions, there's a bit of interference there right now.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's better now, yeah.
Okay, perfect. These source-based ways of talking about sensory perceptions also make it into conventionalized vocabulary, like peach, lemon, and orange all come from their sources, and sometimes obscurely so. So crimson and carmine are color terms that actually derive from the source, which is a beetle that was used to create this red dye. Now, perhaps not available to all of us, but let's say if you're a sound engineer or if you're somebody who's is a vision scientist, you might have specialized vocabulary available that is possible, allows it to describe the physical characteristics of a sensory perception in much detail. But that's sort of embedding your communication in a standardized scientific system, and it's definitely something that more experts would do. And then finally, another semiotic strategy that people make quite abundant use of is metaphor. So specifically, there's a lot of expressions that seem to combine different sensory ideas, and these are very common. So you can say things like high pitch, where we use spatial language to talk about pitch, smooth melody, where we talk about touch, and a touch sensation is sort of transferred onto the idea of a melody. And I'll talk about these in a second, but what I want to highlight is that no matter what any of these semiotic strategies is, something will invariably always get lost. And there's this really cool paper by Stephen Levinson and Asfar Majid that is called The Differential Ineffability of the Senses, and that's was in many ways a motivating paper for my PhD thesis at the time. So Asfar Majid in particular, she has done a lot of work on cultures like, for example, in Southeast Asia, they're the Aslian languages that have very rich smell vocabularies. And what can be ineffable in English, so it's hard to talk about smells, might be effable and actually very easy to talk about in another language, because these languages have smell vocabularies that are as vast as our color vocabularies. And in my book, I sort of build on these ideas and make a bit more nuanced distinctions between different types of ineffabilities. So we have differential ineffability of the senses, and that's the only one that's sort of relative in the sense that some languages make certain sensory ideas easier to talk about than others. But there's certain things that are absolute ineffabilities in the sense that any language will make it impossible to encode these. At least that's my claim. So one is the ineffability of subjective experience. So language is by definition a shared medium, and we agree on a sort of range of accepted meaning for any one given word. We have these conventions in our language, but that's then entails that your specific sensory perception of something is something that will never actually get encoded in language. Like how you are seeing this particular red is lost by using the word red, which is an intersubjective term that we all agree on. So qualia, as philosophers talk about, they are sort of, in a way, impossible to encode in language. Another thing that gets lost is fine perceptual detail. So here's a color chart. And this color chart is carved up in a rather coarse way in language. So a lot of different hues we all label as red. But actually, it should be said that even prior to language, there's a sort of filtering that's happening because even our perceptual system is granular. It doesn't actually encode the reality in just infinite fidelity. Now, here again, this can be construed as a disadvantage, but there's also an advantage to this, which is that it would be very inefficient for language to have a color term for every hue of color in there. We would have a vast vocabulary, and the fact that we don't have that seems to suggest that maybe there's not a communicative need to actually communicate perceptual detail at that level of granularity. And then a final ineffability that's important to me is this multisensoriality, like, for example, eating something and all of the stuff that happens at the same time is impossible to translate into language, precisely because language is a sequential medium and therefore will always force you to sort of paraphrase a multisensory perception in a non-simultaneous manner. So the simultaneity of the experience is something that you cannot communicate by stringing words together. Okay, just very quickly, I have, I think, 5 more minutes. I just wanted to give you a flavor of sort of how this research looks empirically. So this is joint work that I've done with Marcus Perlman and Asfa Majid. And we have used sort of standardized lists of sensory terms and have investigated them. And I found that in all of these, vision is overrepresented. So there are more lexical differentiations in the sensory vocabulary of vision than in particular, for example, in comparison to smell, where there's very few distinctions that exist in specifically the adjective vocabulary. And then in this graph, I don't have time to talk about the sort of stats that are underlying this, but this is an analysis of a large corpus of general American English. Up here means that if a word is, for example, related to vision, then it is also used more frequently by English speakers in this corpus. So you can see that English speakers verbalize visual experience more often, but they actually, the more smell related or taste related a word is, that is actually anti-correlated with frequency in use. So there seems to be a sort of cultural preoccupation with vision in our culture. And that's reflected both in how often we talk about something as well as in the distinctions we make in the vocabulary. Now, very briefly, synesthetic metaphors are one of the ways in which we can make up for lack of words. So if we don't have a particular word to describe a smell, I can, for example, use a taste word to stand in for that. I can talk about a smell being sweet. So that sort of allows me to then use or co-opt linguistic material from other senses to talk about certain things. And as a particular hierarchy of the senses that's been proposed that some of my research has also questioned, according to which touch in these metaphors is a source domain. So it will be a borrower of vocabulary. So you can say, for example, a rough sound or a smooth sound, but it would be weird or to say a squealing feeling or a loud touch. That seems much more metaphorical, but it's also much less frequent in both poetic and general language texts. So this hierarchy, we have currently looking at this again. We're doing a large meta-analysis of literary works, but also non-literary works across different languages. And what we're currently finding together with my colleague Francesca Strick-Levis is that it is indeed the case that specifically taste and touch lend their vocabulary to the other modalities. So, for example, you can use touch to talk about sound impressions. So there's sort of lending modalities, and sound is the ultimate target. A lot of these metaphors are for descriptions of sound. And then finally, we also looked at what specific mappings are overrepresented in the data. And we find that specifically the link between touch and sound is particularly frequent, as well as between sight and sound. So you can say things like a bright sound or silvery sound and so on, a dark sound, and perhaps a bit more expected because things that you can see, you can often also touch. There's also touch maps onto sight. So these 3 mappings are dominant in our data. Okay, now I have 2 more minutes, and I just wanted to maybe leave on a sort of comment that will maybe also stir up the pot a little bit in the discussion. I have this paper that has maybe a bit of an annoying title, Synesthetic Metaphors are neither synesthetic nor metaphorical. We don't have to worry about the nor metaphorical bit because that has really detailed linguistic theoretical discussions that are not relevant for us here. But I do think that these metaphors like smooth melody, dark sound, and so on, they are very frequent in general language corpora. They're not exclusively used by synesthetes. And I've been inspired by Ophelia D. Roy's and Charles Spencer's paper that sort of pushes back against the idea that there's this strong continuity between strong synesthesia, where you, for example, seeing something as you're hearing a sound, and weak synesthesia, and they make the case that actually there's more differences between the two, and then actually we should be talking about, if we're talking about what's shared in the general population, we should be giving it a different name, cross-modal correspondences. And because these synesthetic metaphors don't look much like what has been reported in the synesthesia literature, so for example, color grapheme synesthesia, or colored letter, or colored sequence synesthesia, I make the proposal in this paper that actually these metaphors are really much more related to cross-modal correspondences that are shared in the general population. So with that, that's sort of giving a brief overview of some of the things that we've worked on, and I'm super excited to hear Pat's talk next, and then have a discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Winter. Well, I'm bursting with questions, and I think that, yeah, I think that everybody in the audience also is. But we will listen to Patricia Lynn Duffy first, and then start our discussion. Let me introduce our old and good friend Patricia Lynn Duffy, who is a researcher in synesthesia and author of Blue Cats and Chartreuse Kittens, How Synesthesia Color Their Words, often described as the first book by a synesthete about synesthesia. So the book describes Duffy's own experience of synesthesia, as well as that of so many synesthetes that she interviewed. Patricia is a prolific contributor to synesthesia research literature, including a chapter, Synesthesia and Literature, for Oxford Handbook of Synesthesia. And Patricia has given a number of presentations that I witnessed, and they were great. All of them are great, about synesthesia and literature and her own interpretation and approach to study this from personal perspective and linguistic perspectives. Patricia Lynn Duffy contributes regularly to Journey Through the Senses online magazine and is an instructor of the United Nations Language and Communication section. She is a member of the United Nations Society of Writers and serves on the management committee of the United Nations Staff 1% for Development Fund, as well as the founder of the Development Fund's Author for Literacy reading series. And most of all, I think that most important, that she is also a co-founder and consultant to the American Synesthesia Association. Pat, a couple of words to greet our audience.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it was really fascinating to hear Bodo's presentation, and just very enlightening about ways to look at metaphor and how it's constructed and cultural differences. And of course, Jane's presentation, as a synesthete myself, I identified so much with what she had to say, and was kind of struck by the similar patterns in synesthetes' experiences and discovery of their synesthesia. So my talk, which is coming up now via video, is kind of a reflection on why we have so many novels these days, or so many more than we ever did before, with synesthete characters. And of course, I talk about Jane's wonderful novel, Painting Ruby Tuesday, along with some others, and along with some patterns I've noticed in developing synesthete characters and how they're portrayed. So look forward to our discussion afterwards, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen once more, and you can use the YouTube link if you want to.
Hello, my name is Patricia Lynn Duffy, and today I'll do a presentation called Synesthesia, Identity, and Fiction in a World of Diversity. The American writer Thomas Wolfe once said, "The beauty of the world lies in the diversity of its people." More and more, as the world comes closer together through migration and digital media, the more we encounter the beauties of diversity. Marginalized communities, or those that have been virtually invisible to many, come into view, establish a presence, and join in the conversations of the world. As we have learned and continue to learn to value the cultural and ethnic diversity in our midst, we are now learning to value another aspect of our human diversity, our neural diversity, including those like myself who are hosts to neurological or constitutional synesthesia. Certain aspects of human diversity have been under-recognized or misunderstood. Groups that exhibit these traits have often felt socially marginalized or even socially invisible, and often cannot find their reflections in society's institutions or even in the grand social mirror of art. To better understand their forms of perception, synesthetes and other neurodivergent people often search for formal definitions of their conditions. But a human being is more than a condition. Our conditions, our forms of perception, are integrated into our general patterns of lived experience. Such complexity, the complexity of a human life as it is lived, is best represented by art and literature. However, some groups have not been sufficiently portrayed in the grand social mirror of art, including the literary arts and fiction, or when portrayed, have been very much sidelined as marginal characters. Now that synesthesia and other neurodivergent conditions have come more and more into social focus, synesthetes are telling their own stories. And it's essential for members of marginalized groups to tell their own stories. Good fiction can put the marginalized into the spotlight. It's wonderful to find the fictional works, like the exuberant ones that Jane Yardley, both a novelist and a synesthete herself, has written. Novels that feature synesthete characters as main characters. I first met Jane Yardley at a conference on synesthesia at Rockefeller University in my native New York City. And New York was a very apt place for Jane Yardley to give her presentation, as the city figures very prominently in the novel. So it was a delight to hear Jane Yardley's presentation of her first novel with the colorful title, Painting Ruby Tuesday. Jane Yardley's reading from Painting Ruby Tuesday was a shift in perspective from the many scientific presentations in synesthesia at the conference that day. An absorbed audience listened and took in a scene from the life of a synesthete character as it was lived. Here in this scene from Painting Ruby Tuesday, we see the exhilaration of the main characters, Annie Craddock and Mrs. Clitheroe, as they explore their synesthetic music color perceptions and collaborate on a musical piece, until dull convention interferes. "What colors do you hear there?" Mrs. Clitheroe called to me across the music. "It sounds green to me," I said. "Okay, let's see if I can modulate it to bring you some others." Her Broadway boogie-woogie slid bluely into the relative minor key. "Now?" she asked. "Bluer," I laughed back at her. "It's going blue." "Magic," cried Mrs. Clitheroe, her hands dancing on the keyboard. Until everyday convention interferes. "Knock, knock," said a man's voice. "Are we interrupting something?" It was Doris and Horace Frobisher from Sunday school. I wanted to holler at them. I wanted to scream, "Get out, leave us alone." The scene reminded me of the exhilaration that I felt the first time I met another colored language synesthete like myself in my late 20s, taking a graduate school class in a method of learning and teaching a foreign language called the silent way, where sounds in the language were represented by blocks of color on a chart. My new synesthete classmate Anne and I had difficulty learning the silent way sound color correspondence because the colors differed from our own synesthetic colors for those sounds. Although it was a frustrating lesson for us, it was a delight to at long last and for the first time meet another person who understood what I was talking about when I described my synesthetic perceptions. My new friend and I did a lot of comparing of our colored words, colored letters, and numbers over lunch that day. And it was exhilarating to share our perceptions. Such occasions can turn feelings of isolation into intimacy. They validate our experience. The scene in painting Ruby Tuesday took me back to that moment. Reading fiction can be an occasion to better understand and reflect on our experience, or to better understand and reflect on that of others who are less like us. So the role of fiction is twofold. Good fiction is a mirror reflecting aspects of who we are, and good fiction is a window into the lives of others who are less like us. Within the intimate pages of a novel, readers can explore the experience of being alive with characters who are both like and less like themselves. Readers can discover longings, fears, joys they may have previously thought only they knew, and find that these lone experiences are known on the human scene, part of the recognized terrain of human experience. As the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, that is part of the beauty of all literature. You discover that your longings are universal longings, that you're not lonely and isolated from anyone. You belong. The unique sense of empathy we readers can feel allows us to enter the world of a main character, a new world, or a familiar world that becomes new because we learn it has been experienced by others as well. There have been a number of studies on the connection between reading and empathy and ways in which reading fiction can help to promote empathy toward others, such as those by Keith Oatley and his team at the University of Toronto. And here is a quote from Keith Oatley. Reading fiction enables you to sample a much wider range of possible people and come to understand something about the differences among them. Also from a writer, Marjorie Blackman, reading is an exercise in empathy, an exercise in walking in someone else's shoes for a while. With the renaissance in synesthesia research in the last several decades, Jane Yardley was one of the very early fiction writers to see the literary possibilities in composing stories with synesthete characters. As a synesthete herself, Jane Yardley was able to write authentically and empathically of the synesthetic experience. The art of fiction, well executed, as Jane Yardley's certainly is, provides a way for readers to better know synesthetes and for synesthetes to better know themselves. And by the way, here we have various incarnations of the cover of Painting Ruby Tuesday. Jane Yardley's novel ushered in a spate of novels with synesthete characters by a variety of authors. I made a study of these works in a chapter called Synaesthesia and Literature, which I contributed to the Oxford Handbook of Synaesthesia. I found that portrayals of synesthete characters generally fall into one of these four categories. And so we see some shifting identities in the ways that synesthetes are perceived and depicted. Synesthesia as romantic ideal, synesthesia as pathology, synesthesia as romantic pathology, synesthesia as accepted anomaly. So right now I'm going to just give you an example and a little taste of each type of novel. So in the category of synesthesia as romantic ideal, we have a kind of very romantic view of this synesthetic experience. And we can see this represented in an earlier novel by a synesthete author as well, the great fiction writer Vladimir Nabokov. And he wrote a wonderful novel called The Gift. The main character is Fyodor, a synesthete poet who has a very special aesthetic relationship to language. If I had some paints handy, I would mix burnt sienna and sepia for you as to match the color of a CH sound. And you would appreciate my radiant S if I could pour into your cupped hands some of those luminous sapphires that I touched as a child. So here we see kind of, the poet character being in touch with aesthetic realms that perhaps are less available to non-synesthetes. And another depiction, very different depiction, we have in a novel by Salman Rushdie, Shalimar the Clown, and that is synesthesia as pathology. So here we have the character Colonel Kachwaha, who tries desperately to keep himself in proper military check until his psyche spills over into a bewildering synesthetic confusion. He barely had words to describe these blurrings. He saw sounds nowadays. He heard colors. He tasted feelings. He had to keep control of himself in conversation, lest he ask, "What is that red noise?" So here we see that synesthesia represented as a kind of chaotic blending of perceptions and the character losing control. Now, the third type of depiction is a kind of blend of the first two, synesthesia as romantic pathology. And here synesthesia is represented as a pathology, but it's kind of a blessed pathology because it puts the synesthete character in touch with some very sublime realms, in this case, mystical realms. This is a novel called Lying Awake by Mark Saltzman. The main character is Sister John, who is a nun and a poet. She experiences mystical states where she hears colored and textured singing voices. When he, the priest, began chanting Mass, his voice was a rich sienna, the color of reassurance. Sister Christine sounded as if her throat were lined with mother of pearl, while Sister Anne's voice had more texture like a bowed instrument. Mother Mary Joseph's voice was mostly breath, forming a kind of white sound that helped blend the others. So these very sublime states are followed by debilitating headaches. So the synesthesia of this character is represented as a kind of wonderful blessing, putting the character in touch with transcendent realms, but at the same time involves some suffering. So we have finally the fourth category, which is synesthesia as accepted anomaly. And here the synesthesia is not romanticized. It's not in any way denigrated as pathology. It's simply an unusual trait that a person can experience. And here we have this type of character in the novel Bitter in the Mouth by author Monique Trung. The main character, called Linda, also Lindau, who is an Asian American, reflects on her identity as a member of two minority groups: a racial minority in her all-white town of Boiling Springs, North Carolina, in the southern United States, and a neural minority as a word-taste synesthete. When the character discovers by watching a TV program that the synesthesia she experiences has a history in the arts and sciences, she, quote, looks to the program transcript for an alternative family tree. So in this case, the character has always craved a sense of belonging. She's never quite felt she belonged to any group. And discovering a community of synesthetes with a long history in the arts and sciences kind of gives her a promise of being part of a community. Painting Ruby Tuesday, I would also put in the category of synesthesia as accepted anomaly. Here we have a young 12-year-old Annie Craddock. Here she tries to describe her treasured friendship with a fellow synesthete, Mrs. Clitheroe, to her uncle Arthur. And she likes red songs the best. What's that, sweetheart? Red songs? Yes, because we both hear music in color. Oh, I get you. But I bet you don't really. Mummy and Daddy don't believe me. But Mrs. Clitheroe's got it as well. Got what? We see things in color that aren't, not just music, words, letters, days of the week. Uncle Arthur blinked at me and my eloquence died away. So here we see also some frustration, the synesthete character not often finding people who share or understand her kinds of perceptions, and just so much missing her friend. I won't give away the story, missing her friend, Mrs. Clitheroe. So there is a trend in modern fiction of bringing once marginalized characters into the spotlight. Characters that were once underrepresented or marginalized for a host of reasons: minority status, improperly understood, at odds with the status quo, are now making it to the center of the story, allowing more of us to take our place and meet one another on the grand, diverse social landscape. So to conclude, we'll have a quote from the writer Jacqueline Woodson, who said, "Diversity is about all of us and about us having to figure out how to walk through this world together. When it comes to the above, good fiction is one of our best tools." Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna stop sharing now. That was also an incredible and interesting presentation. I have a lot of questions myself, but we are going to begin the discussion, inviting our speakers to comment on each other talk. So maybe ask a question. So you have this privilege to begin. Please, Jane, Bodo, Pat, whoever wants to begin. You're welcome. Oh, just one more thing. So anyone in the public, if you have a question or comment, just raise your hand, your virtual hand, or write down your comment or question in the chat, and I'm going to invite you to ask your question. Thanks. Yes, please, Bodo.
Yeah, Pat and Jane, I found both of these talks super fascinating. And there's a bit of reverb. Okay, cool. So I had a question because both, Pat, your talk was sort of about how synesthetes are portrayed in literature, and in Jane, in your novel, of course, you focused a lot on synesthetic characters, sort of explicitly making synesthesia an explicit topic in both cases. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on, if we write, we also do all of these subtle differences in terms of the words we choose. And of course, as synesthetes, your perceptions are unique. And I'm wondering whether outside of the context where synesthesia is specifically a topic, you're also using language differently. And if so, how? That would be a question I had.
I don't know whether I'm using language differently, because this is who I am and it's all I know, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think in terms of color, I love color. So I think probably my use of language is deeply influenced by my synesthetic perceptions. That's my guess, but it's the only life I've had, so I can't really compare it with a non-synesthete's life. Pat, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand the question. When you say using language differently outside of the synesthetic experience, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you mean.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I guess what I was focusing on is so in both of your talks, so these novels that are by synesthetes that are also often about synesthesia or have synesthetic characters where it's sort of an explicit topic. I was wondering whether synesthesia also, from your experience, influences writing at a more subtle way. So even when synesthesia is not the topic, similar to what Jane was sort of mentioning about how perceptions can, of course, then drive what we describe.
Well, one thing I can say, I don't know if this is really addresses your question, but how the synesthesia might affect the writing process. And I wonder if Jane has an experience like this. Jane, do you also have a kind of spatial aspect to your synesthesia? Does your alphabet take any spatial form, at least internally when you think about it? Does it have any particular configuration or anything like this?
No,
You don't
no, it
experience
doesn't. Colors and textures and a little bit of taste for some things, but no spatial element at all, no.
Okay, because I
Personality, they have personalities.
Okay, so mine don't have personalities.
There you go.
But definitely colors, and also there's a kind of alphabet trail. There's a kind of upwardly sloping trail composed of colored letters. So I have the feeling of being on this trail when I write something. It's sort of like an internal place that I go when I write. I feel like I'm on this trail. So I'd be curious to know how and I think in a way it sort of helps me to focus if I'm thinking about something, or if I'm in the process of writing something. It's a kind of immersion experience, because, kind of an internal immersion experience of being in a sort of land of language, maybe I could say. So actually that brings me to a question for you, Jane, because you have these other elements that I don't have, like taste involved in your experience of letters, even personality involved in your experience of letters. Does that sort of connect in any way to your experience of actually sitting down and writing?
Well, I can't really allow it to, because for example, whereas the letter R is rather shy and retiring, the letter S is cocky and a little bit aggressive. But I couldn't decide on those grounds that I won't use the letter S. And I have similar ideas about numbers. That influences my life. For example, PIN numbers and code numbers that we use for banking and things like that. I would not choose numbers that were nasty numbers. I know how I sound to. I realize how I sound to a non-synesthete, but that's my life. Regarding the taste, that's more about music. So, for example, the music of Eric Satie, although I can't actually taste it, I know that if I could, it would taste of lemons. So that's bizarre on a number of levels.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah. So Bodo, I don't know whether this connects to your question, but sometimes I guess there is a sense of translating, or because that people you are talking to are not experiencing the words in the same way. So there is a kind of consciousness of that. That maybe this connects also to what Jane was saying on that you can't allow certain kinds of associations that you have to sort of get out there into the general communication, right? So if I like the colors of certain letters better than others, that can't necessarily influence the words I'm going to use. So maybe there is a little bit of this sense of translating for for a more general audience, toning down the synesthesia maybe for to communicate with a more general audience.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it sounds like from what I'm hearing from these responses that there's room for more work, for more empirical work, to look at the writings of synesthetes in more detail, to sort of look at how it differs or may differ amongst dimensions that might have been overlooked perhaps in the past.
Yeah,
So,
I think that would be a really fascinating study,
yeah.
just to really analyze the writings of synesthetes, synesthete writers, just in the way there have been many studies, not many, but there have certainly been more studies of how synesthesia might influence the style of painters who are synesthetes. But I think more work needs to be done in the writing area here, for sure.
Now I think it's time to ask our audience for questions, and the first one is Michael Hallerkamp. Michael, you're welcome.
Just switch to the microphone off. On. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for those very interesting presentation. Every presentation was very nice for me and very intriguing and giving me new aspects. Very good. Thank you very much to everyone. I have a specific question to Jane. You mentioned that music looks different since Wagner, and that is interesting for me. And maybe you can describe a little bit more what it means or what the root cause for that is. There are two things which come into my mind. The first is more complicated harmonies, and the second is we have this original New York feeling here in the background, maybe. And the first is the complex harmonies, and the second one is that Wagner, I think, was the first composer who integrated some sort of soundscape composition into his work. So that means even if you have only one loudspeaker and you hear the music, it has some spatial features, and so it always looks wide. And so I could understand that maybe this supports the appearance of textures. So can you probably explain a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I would love to be able to link the technicalities, the musical technicalities, with my perceptions. I'm afraid I can't do that, but I can only say that music earlier than Wagner will be one color. It might be red, it might be gold, very occasionally it's green. If I don't, and it could be black or white. It does not have texture. It does not have thickness. Music after Wagner often has. And for example, I will hear, or just give you an example off the top of my head, Arvo Pärt. And some of his, I will hear as though it were a river. It's deep blue, and it's an oily blue, and it is moving like that. Nothing prior to Wagner ever does that. Now, I love Bach very much. It's always gold. It has a little bit of a sparkle, the gold, but not really anything that would be called texture. Now, I could try to analyze what it is technically about the music, but we'd be here all night and you would hear me stumbling. So I won't go down that road. But I mean, do we have time for me to say just very briefly? I had thought there were two exceptions for this. And I thought one of those exceptions was the music that I know as Air on a G string. I was brought up in the 60s. And that I did hear with lots of pastels, tiny strings of pastels. And it was a musical friend who pointed out, yes, but Jane, is that when it's played on the original instruments, or is that an arrangement for modern orchestra? And I realized, of course it is. It's only when it's a modern orchestra that I hear it with strings of colour. And that quite shocked me, because I had thought, okay, well, Bach, he was a genius, he's an exception. No, he's not an exception. So it really does work. the idea that which is commonly said, that Wagner brought in new colors and new textures. Yes, he did.
Okay, thank you. Interesting, yeah.
Marina, shall we abuse the power of being?
Yeah, definitely. But there was also a question from Tim, which vanished. So maybe Tim changed his mind. But if you want to ask a question, please do. In the meantime, this is a question, I guess, for all of you. This is like my own area of research, so I'm interested. Do you think there are differences in how people use this multisensory experience? And I mean, not just synesthesia, but just in general, all cross-modal associations, all that. Do you think there's a difference in how we use it in everyday life communication, when we want to communicate a certain meaning, and when people use it in art, in literature, in poetry? To borrow, I'm wondering, is there any empirical data on that? The clouds you were showing to us, like, and how they interact. Are there any changes if you analyze corpus of poetry and literature compared to some everyday examples of speech we use, language we use on a daily basis? And to Jane, the question is, do you, well, probably you do, like when you use language in everyday life, do you think that it differs compared to how you use it when you create literature? Like, probably, I mean, what do you think that the way you use your synesthesia to communicate meaning differs in daily life versus in your artworks? And just to Pat, in your presentation, you said that fiction, literary fiction, has this role in helping us understand other people, like experience empathy. There is actually empirical research which shows that reading fiction makes people understand others better compared to reading nonfiction. So I'm just wondering, what is there? What is the mechanism? What is there in fiction, in art fiction, which helps us better understand other people's experiences? That's it. Thank you.
Jane, did you want to answer your question first?
I can answer my question. In normal conversation, I have to rein myself in and be a lot less flowery than I am when I'm putting words on a page. I have to be a lot less poetic. But also, I mean, there are technical differences. As I think I said in the interview, I'm a very slow writer. So if I write a passage that reads as though it's poetic, I hope it looks as though it's spontaneous. It was not. It took a long time to put down. So in real life, I don't have the ability to come out with the nice, poetic, perfect, if you like, form of words. But I think my synesthesia is behind a lot of the descriptions that I give in normal conversation. And I think that possibly somebody very perceptive like Pat might have known, if she'd known me outside of the arena in which we met, I think she might have guessed from the way I talk. I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So Marina, you asked about what is it about reading fiction that, and yes, I mean, as I mentioned in the presentation, and as you've mentioned, that there have been studies on the connection between reading and empathy, and that reading does contribute to promoting empathy in people. I think there is something about just the fact that each of us is alone with a book that makes it a very different kind of experience from, you know, other kinds of interacting with other kinds of works of art. If you are looking at paintings, you know, you're often in the context of a museum. It's more of a community. It's often more of a community experience, discussing it maybe with whoever you are in the museum with. The same with going to the theater, going to a film. It can be more of a kind of community shared experience. But you know, just the experience of reading a book, you are alone with that book. You are alone with that story. And there's also something, although we're doing it less these days, I guess, with digital media, but there is something about holding a book, turning the pages, kind of being, in that intimate space of a book that I think allows you to really have a deep connection with the characters on a page, a different kind of deep connection than we might have if we are experiencing the same story, but in a more communal setting, like we see that story brought to the stage, or we see that story brought to the screen, or there's something about that kind of intimacy just between you and those characters that I think allows us to kind of, be in a very different relationship and sort of, drop whatever normal defenses that we might have every day, not even realizing it, and just being really open to the world of that other character. So I think it's a very, very special experience, and I hope people keep reading.
Thank you.
I hope we all keep reading.
Bodo, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so more like your question, if I recall correctly, was about whether the difference between everyday situations and fiction. So in this data set that I presented, which is this analysis of which sensory modalities connect to which others, so this is a relatively large data set where we have from 1937, Stephen Ullman was one of the first ones to look at Lord Byron and analyze which cross-modal expressions are more frequent or less frequent in his writings, all the way to modern texts, both literary and general language. So, for example, from corpora or dictionaries. And we actually find that which mappings are overrepresented is not different between general language and literary language. I'm not saying that, of course, literary language is, of course, different. But the idea here in this case is that these cross-modal associations, not necessarily the ones that are unique to synesthetes, but the ones that are, for example, everybody associates brightness or higher brightness with high pitch. That's a quietly like psychological research attests that this is a widely shared cross-modal correspondences. And we think that basically what literary writers often do is they rely on the same intuitions. They have the same cross-modal mappings, but they will have, of course, more embellished, much more elaborated expressions that reflect the same mappings. But which mappings are tested? We in our data have found no difference between sort of everyday language and literary language.
Thank you. So when you say that they use more elaborate kind of, so that's not based on the data. That's just you think that there are differences, but your research didn't find any.
No, our research didn't find any, but the level at which we could have found that difference is not the focus of the study. So that's why I'm saying absence of evidence is, of course, not evidence of absence. There must be differences. Maybe let me just mention one quick thing. So I think that's going to be interesting also to Pat and Jane. So my colleague at the University of Birmingham, Jeanette Littlemore, she has done actually just came up with a new study where they asked both synesthetes of varying types of synesthesia as well as non-synesthetes to give descriptions of sensory stimuli. And then actually she looked at the metaphors that are used by synesthetes and non-synesthetes and found interesting differences. So apparently the synesthetes are using more unconventional metaphors. And to me, that was just like, when I saw that study, I was just like, yeah, like somebody should have done that a long time ago, which is to actually talk more and ask more synesthetes, which I think a lot of this sort of neuroscience research on synesthesia sometimes doesn't bother to ask the people themselves and how they would describe certain things. So that study might actually be an answer to some of your questions, Marina, as well.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Bodo, can you mention again the name of the researcher involved with that study?
Yes, and I might even point it in. So it's Jeanette Littlemore. So literally like Littlemore, yeah. And Sarah Turner. and they have a new book on the many faces of creativity, exploring synesthesia through a metaphorical lens. I just read it a few days ago and I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah. Great. When did it come out?
A month ago or so.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We have another curious inquirer lining up to ask questions. Tim Layden, Tim, are you here? Will you please switch on your mic and ask your question? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes, yes?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Jane and Pat and Bodo. I will apologize, first of all, that I arrived quite late, so I missed quite a bit of this, but through this Q&A, I became interested in the idea of empathy through reading, which I totally agree with. And as an aspiring author in some ways myself, I'm very interested in the idea of the empathy of the author, particularly authors with synesthesia, and whether you use aspects of your experience to understand others, to try and capture aspects of people's personalities that might be very different from your own, and how you might do the kind of research to try to represent fictional or other characters, maybe even not fictional, non-fictional, real people who are just very different from you. Does my question make sense? Can you hear me? Maybe you can't hear me
Yes.
very
Yeah,
well.
we can. Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking about your question. So how we use aspects of our own experience, synesthesia and other kinds of experiences to better understand other people and develop characters. Is that
yeah, and also understand, particularly in maybe in regards to perception and synesthesia, as I'm sure we're all aware, one synesthete and another experience things very differently. So how do you capture another person's experience? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Well, Jane, the fiction writer, may want to respond to this first, but
I don't know how my synesthesia affects my creation of characters. I mean, I think this is probably something I've said a couple of times before, that since I have synesthesia, and I can't imagine, there is no parallel life in which I don't, I can't compare what I do with what I might do otherwise. I'm just not sure how much my synesthesia would be involved in creating characters that are different from my own personality. And I have to say that a lot of my characters are very different from my own personality. Pat, do you have a better answer than mine
I don't have a
to
better,
how writers tackle
better
this?
answer. Not a better one, but
Can I actually add a comment here? I'm very sorry. Yeah, can I just? I think what Bodo actually said might help understanding this thing, how we can explain other person's experience using synesthesia in language. Just as Bodo said, if you don't have words to describe a certain sensation, say a sound, you can use taste words to do that, like a sweet sound. Maybe that is one of the possible mechanisms which you use, which help us understand experiences of other people, like using these words from different sensations. I don't know, maybe it's just like one of the options.
But just one comment on this, I guess. I guess the risk then is that, of course, if you as a synesthete are using a word, what particular sensation is you are experiencing might not be the one that's shared then. So I guess that's the conundrum, isn't it? Because then even, and that's actually also, so Jeanette in her work makes this sort of a very subtle distinction between, we think of it as metaphor sometimes, but for synesthete it might be literal. Because like as Jane, you said, like you're experiencing it,
Yes.
but it seems metaphorical to me.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
okay, yeah. And I would say, just to go back to the questioner, I mean, just on another level, you know, there are also certain social implications, right, to having the experience of a synesthete, where you know, as Jane described, when you first talk about it, other people don't always know what you're talking about, and you're very surprised because this is something you just assumed everybody experienced, right? Until you, I think many of us synesthetes have that same experience. So I think maybe that does give you a kind of greater curiosity about what other people are experiencing, and you know, makes you really look closely and really think about that, and that, I think that might be an advantage in developing a character, a fictional character, because you've kind of learned to have a certain kind of curiosity, and to kind of really look on a deeper level. I think it also makes you less empathetic because you know what it's like not to be understood, and so that makes you, you know, kind of more disposed to try to understand other people that have felt misunderstood and misperceived. I think, you know, an example of that in the novel I mentioned, where I think it was one of the last novels, Bitter in the Mouth, where the character is both the author, Monique Strong, is kind of examining the life of this character who's a minority in two different realms, right? She's a racial minority and she's a neural minority, and kind of making a link between those two experiences. So yeah, so I think that could become an advantage in developing empathy and have implications for creating characters.
Yeah, that's very perceptive, Pat. I think you're right. I just hadn't analysed it to that level. Yes, yes, indeed.
On the topic of similarity and dissimilarity, Marina, just one question to Bodo. Your diagram of the sources of perception and perceptual metaphors, it strikingly resembles our own diagram in synesthesia research of synesthesia types prevalence. So obviously the magnitude are more or less like similar of the sources. So it leads me to question, or to ask this question. Stepping back at the metacognitive level, not just like looking at specific senses in particular in isolation, do you think that in this conundrum of language versus culture versus personal experience and back again, language and something else as well plays a role in granulating and isolating specific senses as well? So could you comment on that? Not just specifically the senses, but stepping back and thinking of the senses as also construals of culture and language.
Yeah, I love that term that you used. I mean, how we reason and think and talk about the senses is, of course, hugely culturally influenced, and that will then also influence the way we speak and the language. So I think that what we're seeing, what I've showed in the diagram, is very much, so we do have quite a lot of languages in the sample, so it's not just English. But I should say that the particular cultures that people have looked at are all from Western or sort of affiliated with Western society in large industrial sort of societies. And I think it's perhaps no coincidence that a lot of synesthesias are color-based in a visually dominant culture. So I think there might be some connection there. It would be super curious and super exciting, and I've never seen any research on this, whether perhaps they're completely different types of synesthesias in cultures that have much more, where smell, for example, is much more culturally important, and there might be different words for smell as well. So I think the synesthesia research itself, while, as Pat like nicely highlighted, it's an important dimension of uncovering neurodiversity. It is also, because psychology tends to look at Western people, a little bit limited, and I think we might be missing dimensions of synesthesia that are hidden in other cultures.
So Bodo, a question I have for you. Yeah, you mentioned about the dominance of visual descriptions and sort of visual focus in Western culture, but you did mention a culture where smell is much more prominent, and in that culture there are more words, I guess, to describe odors that are not borrowed from from our taste vocabulary, but just words that were developed just to describe odors. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true. So it's really fascinating. So Asfa Majid, who I mentioned in my talk, she's sort of one of the primary anthropological psychologists doing field experiments. And she has shown that speakers of these languages, so one of them is Jahai, is the name of the language. They're hunter-gatherers, and speakers of those languages would have adjectives for smells that would be specific to a particular smell, very unlike from English words, where, for example, fragrant doesn't tell you anything about how it actually smells. Neither does rancid, pungent, stinky. None of these words actually, they just describe whether something is good or bad. And they have words akin to color words for smells. And they agree amongst them at rates that are similar to how we agree on color words. If we wanted to agree on smell descriptions, we would never agree on a smell description. People will have different associations with the same smell, and that's because we don't have a conventionalized vocabulary as they do. Yeah,
yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we have run out of time. That was incredibly interesting discussion and talks. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I'm just going to say that the next seminar will be dedicated to synesthesia and music on the 22nd of November. We'll have pianist Janie Chai and a scientist Solange Glasser. And I'll hope to see you all on the 22nd of November. And thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Bye.
See
Bye.
you all.
Bye. Bye.